In July of 2013, I was doing a little solo backpacking around the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington State. With various stops in the Olympic National Park, a few days in, I happened to stop in Quinault and ended up on some random road that dead-ended on a beautiful spot at the edge of the Quinault River. It really was something to see. There was this old footbridge that led across the river, and it looked like something out of the lower of the Rings. With it being July, it was way too hot outside, and there I am, all alone with all this crisp, clean, cool-looking water, just sitting there in front of me. By that point, I don't think I'd actually washed properly for maybe 4 or 5 days, so I wasn't exactly feeling at my freshest. You can probably guess what came next. I drove my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, turned it around, just in case I needed to get out of there in a hurry, then started hiking down an embankment to the edge of the water with a towel in hand. I didn't have any swimwear with me at the time, but I made a note to pick some up in the future and figured a quick dip in my underwear could have me nice and clean without feeling too exposed. It sounds weird. Considering how deep in the woods I was, I mean, it seemed like I was totally alone, but heavy emphasis on seemed. Because as it turned out, I wasn't totally alone. You know how people talk about that feeling of being watched. It seems like a total cliche, doesn't it? Like surely it depends on how paranoid the person is. Well, I'm not in the least bit paranoid, and I'd go so far as to say I'm something of an exhibitionist. I have friends that would rather pony up for a hotel just to use the bathroom. Hence why I was backpacking alone. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily so much as it dawned on me that what I was doing was just a bad idea. I couldn't work out why. At first, it's not like great whites are known to swim up into the quinoa, but in the end it just felt like I was too exposed, too vulnerable. I tried telling myself I was being irrational, but I just couldn't seem to shake the feeling. So after just a few minutes of scrubbing, I climbed out of the river, then walked over to the spot I'd stashed my clothes and towel as I'm walking up the embankment. Keep in mind that I have my back to the other side of the river, and since I was at my clothes and towel, it kind of felt like I was at a home base. Yet just when that feeling of exposure and vulnerability was going away, I happened to catch a glimpse of something on the opposite bank. I honestly thought it was a bear of something at first glance, but it quickly became obvious that a bear was the least of my troubles. At that moment, standing on the opposite side of the river a little higher up than me, was a man. It looked like every single item of clothing he was wearing had been hand-stitched and made from animal hide. His hair kinda looked like dreadlocks, but I later realized some of his hair strands looked more like they've been woven around twigs. You look like a full-on mountain man. Like I remember my skin crawling when I saw my boyfriend playing that dumb cowboy game. Years later, he was obsessed with making animal clothes, and one of his outfits looked almost exactly like my peeping Tom only. Peeping Toms are just an annoyance, whereas I know this guy had other stuff in mind after just staring at each other for a moment. Totally surprised to have come across one another, the guy made a beeline for the rickety old bridge. At first, seeing that made me feel like I was going to puke. I was praying that the worst it would get would be him shouting, "Put some clothes on" or something, but the fact that he wanted to close the distance without even saying anything to me, he obviously didn't have good intentions. I just burst into action and grabbed my car keys, clothes, and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I made the split-second decision to just leave my clothes and get out of there with my life. When I made it out of the blackberry bush, I could see he was crossing the bridge toward me. Rapidly, I got to my car, flung my door open. Just as he'd arrived, I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting. Non-verbally, the moment he went from my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as fast as I could. I looked back and he was chasing after me. He must have run after my car for at least a mile until he faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running, nearly without anything on, through blackberry bushes, and I was wet, unclothed, shaking, and crying, and I hesitated for just a few seconds longer. I don't think I would have made it out alive even typing the story out again. All these years later, I'm starting to shake. I felt like I was being hunted. That is the only way I can describe it. I'll never ever go back to that area. Since then, I always bring a hiking buddy with me when I venture out into the forest. That day is going to haunt me for my life. I've had many years of therapy, and that experience is still as vivid as the day it happened. My name is Tim, and I'm a member of the UK-based walking charity, the Ramblers Association. We're a group that's all about celebrating the pleasures of walking and hiking, as well as protecting the outdoor spaces that people love to visit. I know it sounds pretty boring, and I'll readily admit that most of the membership consists of anorak retirees and Bear Grylls, wannabes, but Sunday morning strolls aren't the reason I got involved with the Ramblers. And when you look into their history, you realize they were actually pretty hardcore at one point. So, to keep it short and sweet, the whole rambling movement kicked off in the late 19th century. Basically, all of these fat cats wanted to just buy up vast swathes of the countryside and make it completely private. Naturally, this caused outrage, and there were protests in the form of mass trespassing on private land. There were scuffles and arrests. People got hurt. It was a huge deal, with the event snowballing into there being an official right-of-way law being passed through Parliament. In short, when you go off rambling, you're not just having a nice weekend walk somewhere. You're exercising hard-earned political rights. You're maintaining your fundamental freedom to access naturally beautiful places. And to me, that's a beautiful thing in and of itself. Excuse the plug, but that's generally what I tell people to spark a kind of rebellious interest in the Ramblers. We are a proselytizing organization after all. But trust me, there are plenty of things I don't tell them about rambling things, that if I did tell them, might put them off. Exploring green spaces for good, because if you go out on the regular exploring forests and woodland and hill country of all types, you're bound to have a few encounters that you can't quite explain, and a few that downright scare you. And since I've already bored your socks off with the Ramblers' history and ethos, I suppose it's fair that I share a creepy story with you. This is something I personally discovered while rambling near Monmouth in Wales. So I'm walking through some rather deep woods around a place known as the Forest of Dean. I come across what I assume was this unremarkable little clearing. I had no intention of walking into it. It was drizzling, and the trees were providing a nice bit of cover, and it only really caught my attention when I saw what looked like a ball of grass, just floating in midair. It reminded me of one of those physical anomalies from the Tarkovsky film, and I just remembered stopping and staring at it for a moment as it gently swayed back and forth in the breeze. Obviously, on further inspection, I discovered that it wasn't really floating there. It was just hanging from a tree limb high above it, and still someone had apparently made a ball of grass. And being the naturally curious soul that I am, I walked over to investigate. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't quite what I'd first expected it to be. At a distance, it just looked like a load of baled grass, but on closer inspection I realized it was all solid turf. Like, imagine if someone had just cut up a section of your garden and tied it into a ball. Only when I tried to find the seams of the thing, I couldn't see any. It was like a miniature planet or something. And for a good minute or so, I was absolutely transfixed by it. The twine used to tie to the tree looked like it was homemade and entirely natural, and I imagine it must have taken someone of considerable skill to make it strong enough to hold the weight of the turf ball. Not only that, but it was tied to the tree branch of this old oak tree that had to be at least 20 feet up in the air. If nothing else, it made for an impressive piece of craftsmanship, and whoever had made and hung the thing was obviously very dedicated. I remember giving the turf ball a gentle push and then watching it sway back and forth for a moment as the patter of the raindrops was joined by the creaking of the big old branch above me. That's when I caught sight of what was below the hanging turf ball, and what I saw almost took my breath away. Directly below the turf ball would look like an old tree stump. Only this particular tree stump looked like it had been filed or worn down by something until it was almost at ground level. The actual wood itself had been completely hollowed out, so that only a thin ring of wood and bark surrounded an intricate display of twigs, reeds, and interwoven wildflowers. The pattern was like a series of expanding circles, kind of like a blooming rose, and there had to have been hundreds of small twigs in there, some bent into curves to achieve a bizarre, almost three-dimensional effect. I honestly think it must have taken days to put the whole thing together. I couldn't see any patches of grass missing from the clearing, so I'm guessing someone bought or grew the turf ball elsewhere and hauled it into the woods. They probably brought a ladder too, or some complete mad lad, because climbing up a 25-foot oak tree is no mean feat either. I figured it might have been some kind of guerrilla heart installation, or maybe the pet project of some eccentric green-fingered landowner. I don't know. But as I kneeled down to get a closer look at the tree stump rosebud thing, I noticed that not all of the little pieces were twigs. I picked out one piece thinking it looked a lot like an old bone, only to find out that's exactly what it was given its small size. I initially figured it was just an animal bone, all before I heard a voice in my head telling me that it could just as easily come from a human finger or toe, thoroughly creeped out. I dropped the bone the very same moment the thought occurred to me, but for some reason I couldn't bear to leave it out of position and out of some strange sense of fear. I placed the small bone right back in the exact place I'd taken it from. My next thought is obviously something along the lines of, people need to see this. Only right as I stood up to reach for my phone, I swear I heard someone moving in the tree line behind me. I was a bit startled, and as I turned, I remember hoping it was whoever created the bizarre natural construct I'd been transfixed by. But there was no one there. There's plenty of wildlife around Monmouthshire, and you get all kinds of deer, badgers, even weasels in some parts. So, just because I heard a noise, it didn't mean it was a person, but I didn't hear any more scampering or rustling, as whatever it was scurried away from me. And it was just silence. That's when I started to get the horrible feeling that someone was watching me out of pure nervousness. I called out a greeting again, hoping it was the turf ball's creator and they were just, I don't know, nervous or something. Again, total silence, but it wasn't like I just imagined that noise behind me. There was most definitely someone or something there. I ended up putting my phone away, not daring to take any pictures. I had this deep, primal fear that if I had turned my back on whoever was out there, they might just use the opportunity to approach with less than pure intentions. I mean, if they'd already been willing to kill or at least procure bones for their little art piece, God knows what they'd be willing to do to defend it. Maybe it was just my years playing tricks on me combined with the mounting strangeness of what I was seeing, just somehow getting the better of me. But I ended up backing away from that clearing, then basically power walking away with my head on a swivel until I was satisfied that I was at a safe distance. Safe from what though? And as I started to consider that the kind of haze of surrealness I'd been experiencing ebbed away, and I suddenly was left asking, what in God's name had I just seen? I wanted to go back, I really did. But the strong compulsion to stay away was the only thing that dwarfed the desire to go back and document the thing I tried to tell myself. It was nothing more than the work of bored hippies, and I'd simply spook myself by picking up an old animal bone that was the most logical explanation, and therefore the most likely. So, why couldn't I seem to calm myself down enough to walk back? I'm not a believer in the supernatural. I certainly like to think I could handle myself in a fight. And I know I'm biased, but the last word I'd use to describe myself is cowardly. But on my mother's eyes in that moment, every fiber of my being was just screaming for me to get away and never visit that place again. I did end up going back. By the way, this is a true story, not some daft horror film with plot holes you can drive a truck through. Granted, it was weeks after the original encounter. It literally took me that long to pluck up the courage, so it gave whoever made the thing enough time to get rid of it. The amount of work that had gone into such a bizarre thing on top of how visually interesting it was almost a shame to see it gone. Someone had dug up all the inlay of the tree stump and had cut down the turf ball that had been hanging from the tree. I say almost because somehow, the fact that it was all gone now made the place all the more ominous. Like, I get that someone else might have stumbled across a thing, maybe even bored kids who just decided to vandalize it. But then what if it was just me discovering the place that prompted its destruction? And what if it had been destroyed to hide what was going on there? In which case, what exactly had they been doing? And what was so wrong that they'd felt they needed to hide it? I kicked over the remains over the tree trunk pattern, hoping to find one of the little bones I discovered previously. But there were none to be found then, just like last time. Yet, without the feeling of being watched, I backed away from the clearing and went about my ramble. The whole turf, bald tree stump combo is without a doubt the single strangest and creepiest thing I'd ever seen, while out rambling. Probably the creepiest thing I've seen in my entire life. Actually, sure, on the surface it looked kind of cool, but the more I think about it, about the bones, about the strange person who wouldn't announce themselves, about what it could all mean, the more I'm just glad it's gone. I'm 25, and ever since I was young, I've been into hiking. Now, I get hiking isn't all that appealing to most people, but because of where I live, it's pretty easy to get into. You don't have to travel all that far for a pretty stunning scenic view. I try to find a new trail to hike every weekend. Typically, I'll hike alone, so I always keep a knife in my backpack for protection against the wildlife. Should it never come to that, though, in all my years of hiking, I've never once had to actually use it. In fact, I've never run into any dangerous situation while hiking. Wow, at least up until a few days ago, I was driving to a heavily forested hiking trail I'd never been to before. Now, I hike in the afternoon, and this happened around the time of year where the days were starting to get shorter. In other words, the sun was setting earlier and earlier each day. This was a key detail that I had completely forgotten about prior to leaving. Only after I started driving to the place did I realize it would be completely dark outside before I would even be able to finish my hike. A decision I still regret making is deciding to do the hike anyway. I got a bad feeling about it, right? When I started fast forward a few hours and I was now about 85, finished with the route I picked out. By this point, it was almost completely dark. I had a flashlight, but still. I mean, the whole scene was pretty eerie. This portion of the trail was deep in the forest. It was so dense with trees that the moonlight could barely even find its way through. Don't get me wrong, beautiful scenery in the day, but alone at night, nothing short of disturbing it was. Then, when I was really starting to regret my decision of carrying out the hike, that's when I saw a light up ahead on the trail. As soon as I shined my flashlight in its direction, it immediately got turned off. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't exactly turn back, so I was pretty much forced to go directly towards where it had been in the back of my mind. I knew the chances of it being another hiker in the dark were slim to none. Eventually, I reached where the light came from. There was no one. Instead, there was a large duffel bag lying on the ground. I began scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when a large, probably 6.5-foot man stepped out from behind one of the trees. My body completely froze up there. I stood like a deer in headlights, shining my light on the guy. He then slowly revealed a machete from behind his back. Seeing this, I started running for my life down the trail, and in the direction of my car. I looked behind me and the guy was chasing me. I dropped my backpack so I could run faster when I finally reached a clearing in the forest and could see my car still sprinting. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and unlocked it. I got inside, locked the doors, and had the engine on in less than 5 seconds. However, the guy was still behind me and was able to completely slash one of my back tires before I could drive off. I drove on an almost completely flat tire for the next 5 miles back to my house. Right as I pulled into my driveway, I called the police and reported the man, although I have no idea if he was found. Quite frankly, I have no idea if the police even searched for him. A part of me wants to go back to retrieve my backpack, which contains hundreds of dollars in equipment, but there's no way I can bring myself to do it. Plus, there's no guarantee it's still even there for all. I know, the guy went back and took it. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that night. This was, by far, the scariest experience I've ever had and the closest I've ever felt to death. You